Hey, welcome everybody from wherever you're at around the world today. Thank you for stopping by. I do appreciate it. This is the first installment, if you will, of Colonel Simon Fraser's 78th Regiment. If you're unfamiliar, they were a Scottish regiment that was raised to fight for the British in the 7 Years' War. Some call it the French and Indian War in Quebec, Canada, up in North America. And they served there from 1757 through 1763 when they were sent home to be disbanded. After the war, some of the men remained in the Quebec area, New York. Some of them came down into now the United States to live life. They were promised a land grant, and some of those people accepted the land grants. Others, we don't have evidence of that. But I want to talk to you for a few minutes today about the website, about what I'm trying to do. My name is Jeff. I'm a retired Chief Petty Officer with the United States Navy. And in 1998, I got started into researching the regiment because family lore suggested that my sixth great grandfather was part of the regiment. We didn't have proof yet, so I set out trying to prove that. And I've run across, over the course of the last 25 years, I've run across a plethora of information. And I started the website about 6 years ago. We'll get into the website here in a few minutes. But I started it in hopes of not only putting out the information that I located and to continue to put out that information for other researchers. It was a way of meeting other people. I get a lot of email now from around the world, people contacting me, looking for information, whether it's on their ancestor or whether it's just general military information pertaining to the regiment. It varies, the contacts who reach out to me. So yeah, I wanted to put the website together, and I thought that this would just be a natural progression, going from the website, moving into video, taking advantage of technology and all it has to offer. Before I get started, just a couple house cleaning notes. First thing is this website's dedicated to those men, women, and children who gave their lives in some cases for what we have today. And if you think about it, the 7 Years' War was really one of the first major battles that was fought on North American soil. Great Britain, England was in, they didn't like the French and the French didn't like the English. Let's just say that. And King George, he wanted to come in here into the United States, into North America, and he did. And he wanted it for himself, excuse me. So I'd like to take just a moment, just a few seconds, a moment of silence to pause for the bravery, for the gallantry, for the resilience that these men, women, and children, for what they endured, if you will. And I'd like to celebrate that. Okay, thank you very much. Let's get into why we are here today. The first step is I want to show you around the website, what I've started. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to provide something for everybody. And when I say for everybody, I was talking a few moments ago about people have contacted me looking for vital records. Some people have contacted me once they find their ancestor and make that connection, or if they haven't made that connection, just looking for whatever information might be available. So this top portion of the website, and I'll leave a link obviously down in today's show notes to get to the website. Top portion of the website is specifically towards administrative stuff. There's an about section, contact us. Facts, I would definitely take advantage of the facts section. Go ahead and skim on over that, because what I've tried to put in there is I've tried to answer questions the best I could providing answers for people that have asked more common questions. So, for example, how do I find my ancestor among all the records you have would be a common question. We do that through the search bar here. Just type in the last name. I will caution you when you're searching for your ancestor's name that there are spelling variations, many spelling variations. And I have a fast link down on, you saw how I did that down on the right-hand side. These are just labels. And I label each post that I do. And you'll come across surname variations and you see some of the different spellings. All right. Again, going back to the mid 1700s, a lot of this stuff was done phonetically, and it was all dependent on the company scribe or the regimental scribe or whoever was putting these names together on paper. You see, for example, look here on Campbell, you got, 4 different variations as far as spelling. So don't get frustrated if you don't find a specific surname that you're looking for right away. Think outside the box, think like you're doing genealogy work, and try all the different spelling variations. So I've got the administrative stuff up top. I do research if you're interested in having research done. I will say that if you contact me and if it's something I can get to you in just a matter of minutes, if it's something pretty common that I've dealt with before, I can go into my records and I can pull it right out for you. I'm not going to charge you for that. But as the website has started to grow over the last 6.5 years, I found myself starting to dedicate more time to each individual question which comes through. And I'll just give you an example. The last big project that I did, I had about 6 to 8 hours of research, and not only the research aspect of, but of taking all that stuff, compiling it together, getting it into email format, and answering questions back and forth. And it accumulated up to about 6 to 8 hours worth of work. And it gets to be a little bit too much. And now that I'm taking this thing I'm putting it out there through video, I hope to reach a wider audience. And that could potentially mean more questions that are coming on in and more time I have to dedicate to helping people. So again, if I can knock something out for you in 5, 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so, I'll fire it off to you. There's not going to be a charge to it. But if we start getting into an hour, and 2 hours, I do have to charge for that. I've set up a little store page here for publications. I'm working on a new book, which I've advertised right here, called Water's Edge. And this is going to be from the formation of the regiment to their departure for North America. They were formed in early January 1757. They departed June 30th, 1757 from Cork Harbour, Ireland. And I want to cover everything, from January 1st through June 30th. And there's a lot to it. Been working on that for quite a while now. I've got a free preview. If you want to see the preview, the book's introduction, you can just click the free preview link and it'll take you to a download. You download it. It's in PDF format, no charge. Save it to your desktop, whatever you want to do. I've got a couple other small little publications that I've done, Scottish researchers. This is on my direct ancestor. So there's a bunch of little things. Oh, this one here, I want to point this out to you. This is a map of the North Atlantic Ocean, and it covers the from England and Ireland to the east over to the United States here on the west hand side. And you can download it. It's free to download. I'm going to see if I can enlarge this. Yes, I can. And if you enlarge it, let this render. So what I did was I found the ship's logs, the captain's logs for HMS Enterprise, which was a man of war ship, and it was hired to convoy 8 transport ships for Colonel Fraser and his men. We think it's a 9th. We know of 8. We're working on a 9th transport ship. But anyways, I plotted their course all the way from Ireland, Cork Harbour, Ireland. Again, this is slow rendering because I haven't downloaded it here, but you can see all the different dates. and working on down. They went down through the Azore Islands, continued sailing west. I've got each day marked on out, and I get them up into the Halifax, Nova Scotia area. This area where it says August 20th, HMS Enterprise actually anchored, I think it was on the 28th or 29th. I'd have to check the records. But I kind of lost track around August 20th. It's very difficult using the provided longitudes and latitudes that were provided. Very difficult to track them properly after the 20th, but it gets them up in there. You can print this on out, save it on a thumb drive. You can take it to your local Office Depot type store if you want to have it printed on out. There's instructions here. If it's something that you just want to look at on your computer, I would recommend downloading through faststone.org. You just click this link right here, and it's a preview. Get the first one, Faststone Image Viewer 7.7. And because I'm not looking at the map right now through Faststone, that's why it was rendering. But Faststone will render it so much quicker, and you won't have that lag. So that's what I did with the store. And then getting into the major links, you've got the companies. I put all the different companies, and what each company, when you click on a company, these are transcribed records, the subsistence records from August of 1763 for each of the companies. This is what you're primarily going to be researching when it comes to your ancestors. If you don't know the information, the first thing to do is to see if you can find them on these August 1763 subsistence rolls. The problem, as you see, though, is the more peculiar the name, the more abstract the name, the easier it's going to be. But like in this case, we've got 7 Donald Camerons? 6 Donald Cameron. No, there's a 7th one up here. All right, so if your ancestor, like anything else in genealogy, if your ancestor has a common name, it makes it difficult. But all is not lost, because for these men that remained in Canada, up in Quebec, Canada, at the end of the war, a lot of them, I want to say a lot of them, about 400 that we know, 400 of about 900 that were remaining at the end of the war, 400 of them went on to join one of 3 regiments that remained in Canada at the end of the war to provide guard over the Quebec, Montreal, and the Trois-Rivières area. Those were the 15th Regiment of Foot, the 27th Regiment, and the 60th Regiment. So what I did was I was able to pull muster records for all 3 of these regiments after the war and transcribe what names came from Fraser's regiment and went on into these different regiments. I will caution on 2 of the regiments, all as we have is a date that they entered. And why it can create some problems is because on those regiments, we had to pull from these 14 companies here, I had to pull names that were synonymous with men that were in these regiments. One of those, for example, like on the 27th Regiment, the names were pretty cut and dry on the muster reports, and it specifically says 78th Regiment. So I know 100% these guys all came from the 78th Regiment. But again, on these other 2, it's a little bit different. They're not listed by regiments, they're just listed by the date they entered. And I feel pretty confident that those are the guys. So I've got the companies. You can go down each company. Again, you can use the search button. I'll skip editorials for a second. We'll come to that last. I've got some land records here. There's colonial land records and Quebec land petitions. The colonial records were for men. These are petitions for men that came down into the New York area, New York, Connecticut. And there are some Vermont records. I don't have them on here yet. I just have a couple of Vermont records. But you can see they basically migrated down into the Northeast primarily down into the Albany area. Here's one, Albany, east of the Hudson River. Again, they're listed by names. They got the 70th Regiment, all the different petitions. These start in 1763, and these go through 1771. A lot of good information there. With these records, if you find a petition that interests you, then you need to get a hold of the New York Land Office at Albany. They maintain the actual records. So because they have a petition, if permission was granted, the petition was accepted, there'll be some type of grant record that would go with that. So you want to get with the county clerks, the land office at Albany, and they can set you up if the record is available. And then the Quebec land petition, I have a lot of the Quebec land petitions already. A lot of good information here about the land patents, how many acres were authorized. Like private soldiers were only authorized 50 acres, but they got 50 acres not only for them, they got in some cases 50 acres for having a wife and having another 50 acres for having a child. So they could have got, depending on how many kids they had, 150, 200, 300 acres, whatever. And it goes on up, non-commissioned officers, staff officers. And then we start getting into the petitions. Now, the petitions were not issued until 1765. And the reason for that was, the war ended in late 1763. And then England was still working on how things were going to work in the early to middle parts of 1764. They were trying to figure out exactly how they were going to divide up land and what land would be available. And then, of course, 2 months sailing time for correspondence to get on out to the government, the new government that was being formed in Quebec. And then, of course, they had to figure out what they were going to do. They had to get somebody who was going to be in charge of all this. So they started issuing petitions. The earliest one here I found was March of 1765. A lot of names in here. These guys, all 99% of them are from the 78th Regiment, but you can go through and you can see if you can find a petition for your ancestor. A lot of these petitions and grants I've already downloaded from the Library and Archives website up in Canada. I have them here if I have a petition. And that's one of those things I was talking about. If I can find something in 15 minutes for you, if you're looking for a land petition, I go into my land records, I pull it, I can fire it off to you. It's not a problem. I've got some payroll records that I've been transcribing. These are from Major James Clephane's regiment. He was one of two majors that were assigned to serve under Colonel Simon Fraser. And luckily, years ago, I was able to get approximately, I think it's about 90 individual pay records. And you can see the ones that have links are the ones I've already transcribed, but I left the names of the ones I haven't transcribed yet, just in case you can find your ancestor among those. Again, I can fire off a pay record to you, not a problem. But it's one of those things too. You start getting into common names, William Ross, John Ross, Malcolm Ross. Some of these are very common names. Look, there's a couple, 2 John McIntoshes, 2 Peter McGregors. Which one is your ancestor? We don't know. I also went into the pensioner records. Pensioner records are related to Royal Chelsea Hospital, which is in London. So if you're in England or Scotland, you're probably familiar. You've probably heard of the Royal Chelsea Hospital. If you're up in Canada or down in Australia, here in the United States, you may not have heard of it. We have in the United States what's called the Veterans Administrative Medical Centers or medical hospitals, which is really styled after the Royal Chelsea Hospital. The Chelsea Hospital came into existence in the late 1600s, and basically it was a place for veterans to go get help after the war for their injuries, whether they were sick, whether they broke a leg, whether they were shot, who knows. But it was a place for them to go on in where they could get help. And it's now turned into they have like a retirement home there. And that's what we do here with the VA medical centers here in the United States. Canada, I don't know what you guys have up there. If somebody could chime on in, if you know a little bit more about it, if you want to leave some comments and maybe give me a little bit of a backstory, it's something we can all learn from, and I would appreciate that. But I've gone into the available Chelsea records for the 78th. Well, not only for the 78th Regiment, I'll show you at the bottom here, but again, we'll just cover one here. This guy, John McDonald, came in November 1758, age 19. He served for 2 years. He has an amputated hand that he picked up in Louisburg. That was one of the first skirmishes or battles that Colonel Fraser's men were involved in. He was born in Inverness. His occupation was a baker. What a treasure trove of genealogical information for the right researcher. So I hope, well, I'm sorry if your ancestor got hurt, but on the flip side to that, I hope you're able to tap into this little database here and you're able to find some information that might help prove who your ancestor was. I talked about earlier about how some of the men went over to the 15th Regiment, the 27th and the 60th Regiment. So those guys, they would have served from 63. It depends how long they signed a contract for. They could have been out in 64, 65. In the case of my ancestor, he left the 78th Regiment and then he served another 4 years. So he served through 1767. But I was able to pull down at the very bottom here names that were synonymous with those from the 15th Regiment. And I don't remember exactly where the division starts, but you'll find it somewhere down in here. Oh, here we go. This is after 1767. And again, I pulled names from the 15th Regiment that were synonymous with men in the 78. And of course, these guys from the 15th ended up going to Chelsea Hospital. I'll talk about recruitment in a second. And then, of course, vital records. We've got some birth records, some marriage records. There are some death records and known widows. Got links to all that. I want to talk about marriage records first. This is the number one question that I get asked. People are looking for marriage records for their ancestor. They're pretty confident their ancestor served in the 78th Regiment. They haven't proven it yet, but they've contacted me because they can't find a marriage record from, for example, 1760-ish up through about 1770, or maybe even shorter, maybe 64, 65 at the end of the war type of a thing. And that was the same situation that I was in. And I'm not going to go over it in depth, but I have a whole section here which explains what I've learned. Bottom line is, if you're looking for a marriage record between 1757 and 1763 for a soldier in the 78th who purported to get married in Canada, you're not going to find it. They do not exist. And the reason for that quickly is commanding officers were not granted permission to permit their soldiers from marrying. That's one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is the women, they had to prove to the church that they were able to marry. For example, they had to be able to prove that they didn't have a significant other sitting back in the old country, back in France. So you had two parties that had to get permission, and the commanding officers were not giving out permission. The other aspect of that is the religious aspect. You got the British side, which was of one religion. You've got the French side, which was of another religion. They were the Roman Catholics. And could you imagine a bride, if she got permission, going to her family and say, I want to go and marry a soldier of another religion? And then what's the soldier going to do? Is the soldier going to try to get permission, which he didn't get, and then go into a Protestant church and get married, or try to have the reverend or the chaplain of their regiment marry them? So it's kind of confusing. There's a lot of moving parts to this, but I want to touch on that real quick. So if you're looking for marriage, just stop by here and you can read everything that I've had to offer. Let's get into the recruiting aspect of it. The recruiting portion, I've put in here what I know and what I have learned about recruiting in Colonel Fraser's regiment. There's a lot of moving pieces to this. And there's one area here, what an enlistment contract looked like. I actually found 3 enlistment contracts in Major Clephane's paperwork. And the reason why there were 3 different ones is because these contracts were all handwritten and there were different people that were writing them up for the soldiers in Clephane's company as the men were being recruited and brought on in. In fact, Major Clephane's sister, Betty Clephane, or she married, her name was Elizabeth Rose, her married name, but her surname and what she went by was Betty Clephane. And she was writing out the attestation papers, and his niece was also involved. She was involved in the recruiting process, and she was also writing up the papers. So that's why I found 3 different copies of an enlistment contract. There is one known surviving record of recruits, and it lists 11, but one of these men, I'm just reading here, note a recruit named David Ross. So there was actually 12. A recruit named David Ross, not listed, was discharged early March for having fits. So there was actually 12 originally recruited, the first 12 that were recruited for Major Clephane over in the Dundee area. I'll get into a recruiting map in a minute, show you all that. But this is the only known paperwork which discusses recruits actually enlisting. Now, when I say the only known one, Betty Clephane has some notes where she lists a bunch of recruits, but it's very scattered. And as I get into more episodes of this podcast, vlog, whatever you want to call it, we'll talk about more of the recruiting process and how it went down, and I'll get into more of those papers. But I just wanted to point out to you, maybe you'll get lucky. In fact, one person did contact me about this recruit named Alexander Bell. That was a few years ago. He was interested in this guy. Whether it turned out to be his ancestor or not, I don't know. Talk about recruiting expenses. A lot of good information in here. So please, let's stop on by if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the recruiting process. But I want to get into really quick now is this recruiting map. So over the years, what I've done is from a variety of sources, I've compiled this map of possibly birthplaces, but also it's a combination of birthplaces and a combination of where soldiers were at, where they enlisted in the Army. So it may not necessarily be, well, let me rephrase that. In many cases, there are birthplaces that were listed. Some cases, there weren't birthplaces. And I got this stuff, I pulled it from a variety of sources. Some cases, it just discusses where they were from, but that doesn't mean where they were from when they enlisted was necessarily where they were born. So I started compiling them. Each colored circle, let me rephrase that. 98% of the colored circles represent a soldier. The numbers on each colored circle, and I'd like to apologize in advance if you're colorblind. This is not meant to be anything derogatory that you can't see colors. I know we all have challenges, but I want to say that in advance. But each number on a circle represents my internal tracking. So for example, number 37 or 326 here, that's, again, I just go to my chart and I'm able to look up number 326 and see who that person represents. I said 98% of the colored circles. That's because, and I have this legend up here, I've got a couple colored circles. The first one here, it's got AQ written on it. Those are authorized quarters. So when the regiment was in the recruitment process, there were 3 authorized recruiting depots, one to the north in Inverness, one over here to the kind of mid-east of the country in Dunkeld. That's just north of Perth. And there was another one right here in the Midwestern or the south, I guess that's the southern portion of County Inverness. And that is near Fort William. So you had these 3 recruiting depots, if you will, where men were sent to. So for example, we do know, or we can surmise, if you will, that those people up in the northern area, maybe up in this area, were all sent down to Inverness. And we do know through, I think I found it in the newspaper, Captain Simon Fraser, who was recruiting over here. I'm sorry, he was from Fraserburgh. He was responsible for recruiting all in Aberdeen area. And we do know he pulled 111 or 110 recruits out of Aberdeen, which were shipped on over to Inverness. But then as you start getting to the lower half of the country, now the Highlands, if you ever get into the history books or if you've gotten into the newspapers, they talk about recruiting in the Highlands goes on successfully. And that's because Inverness to the north was headquarters for the regiment. And these other 2 areas were subsequent. So these men that were down to the south, excuse me, I'm having a little technical difficulty here as I clean this up. All right, here we go. So these men that were down, for example, in Glasgow, because down in this area, this bottom half here is going to be the lowlands down here, right? So these men were sent on over to the Dunkeld area. And of course, anybody else would have been sent, like these guys over in here were probably all sent on over to Fort William. It's possible your Argyle men, depending on where in Argyle, some could have gone up here, some could have gone on over to this area. We just don't know. It's not 100% certain, but what I do know and what I have learned is there's a newspaper extract of about 90 men that were originally sent to this depot were moved in early February of 1757. They were moved on up to, these men down here in Glasgow, down in this area, were moved on up to Dunkeld in early 1757. And that was to make room for the other regiments, because you got Greenock Harbor, Port Greenock right in here, and you had other regiments that needed to ship on out. But those regiments were first garrisoned in Glasgow, typically on the Glasgow Green. Officers probably stayed in the barracks or the local churches or something somewhere in Glasgow, but they had to make room. So Fraser's men, the early recruits, were shipped on up to Dunkeld. And there's also evidence, and I'll talk about it more as we get into the recruiting process. Colonel Montgomery from the 1st Highland Battalion, later the 77th Regiment, that was raising at the same time, they had their headquarters was up here in the Inverness area, and they initially sent men on down to get a head start, get him to Glasgow, but then they were turned around and they were sent back. And we have correspondence on that saying that they were sent on back because of the regiments that were shipping on out from North America. So there's a lot of good information that I've learned. Again, we'll talk about that more during the recruiting process. I want to share a map with you. If you're interested in this map, please let me know, and I will go ahead and I'll submit it into the website where I'll get you guys a link where you can download this map from if it's something you just want to have for quick reference. So let's get into the final aspect of the website, which is going to be the editorial section. I saved that for last because I want to cover a couple different aspects here. The editorial section, if you've ever worked with digital archives online, there's a couple different repositories, if you will, that offer newspapers that have been scanned, and they use that OCR, which is optical character recognition. You just type in a keyword, and if they can find it in the newspapers that they offer, it spits it back. So what I did was, really for the last 6 years or so, I've gone into these old newspapers and I pulled out really anything and everything that I could find related to Colonel Fraser and his regiment. I've transcribed them all, and as you can see, it starts in the first one here is late 1756. We'll talk about these first couple entries, and it goes all the way down through 1772. There's a lot of wonderful information contained just in these newspaper extracts. So if you're not into the genealogy aspect of things, but you're into more of the history of the regiment, how the regiment moved about, where they were at. For example, they were in Boston and then they grabbed some transport ships and moved on up into New York or whatever was available in the newspapers. You might find that type of information in here. I've been getting into a lot of the ship's records, which is something totally different. And those come through the National Archives out of London. I have a contact there. I tell her what I need, and then she goes in and she makes copies of it for me. But with the newspapers, again, just a lot of fantastic information. I would encourage you to just stop on by, take a look. Maybe it has something that you didn't know about, and maybe it has something that might prove useful for your research. And that leads me into the final topic that I want to talk about today for this first episode is the initial raising of the regiment and how it kind of started, how it all started. In mid 1756, General Abercrombie, who was the commander of forces in North America at the time, he was basically sacked. That's just the nicest way to put it. The poor guy probably did a decent job. He got fired. He got canned. And it was really, he got canned, I think, because of what happened at Fort William Henry and that fort turning over to the French. Things didn't go well. They got rid of him. And the British leadership brought in Lord Loudoun, John Campbell. He was a former commander of the 64th Highland Regiment. And he was brought on in, obviously, because Britain had bigger plans and they wanted to go take Quebec. And they wanted to kick the French out. So Loudoun comes on in. Again, I think it's July 23rd. Don't quote me on that. It's June or July, one of the two. I always forget which one, but I think it's July. And he does an assessment. He lands in New York and he starts doing his assessment. And around October, I want to say it's going to be somewhere around September 15th through October 1st, he sends correspondence back to the War Office. And I haven't yet located that correspondence, but I've just kind of done the math. I'll show you here. I think it's around September 15th to October 1st. I based that on about 45 days of, sea travel to get back, for correspondence to get from North America back to the War Office. An article appears November 29th, Monday, November 29th, it's published, and it's referencing an article that was first published on November 23rd. So let's take about a week off of that date. for the editor to get the information and get it into publishing and into print. Let's say that took a week. That puts you around November 15th or so. And then, of course, if you go 45 days from October 1st, that gets you to November 15th for the letter to get back. So that's why I use that October date. Anyways, it says, and this is from Lord Loudoun. I'll read it. This last express from Lord Loudoun contains no request of being recalled, but he therein desires a reinforcement of 5,000 men, at least, which he recommends to be raised in the Highlands of Scotland and to be accoutred in their manner. The English marching regiments, not being so capable of bearing the fatigue of frequent journeys in that country. He also desires a draft from the train of artillery with some small traveling cannons, which request we hear is ordered to be complied with forthwith. These 5,000 men, these are going to be Highlanders from the 1st Highland Battalion, from the 2nd Highland Battalion, which are going to be raised starting in January, and another contingency of men were coming in from the 42nd, which are also being raised. So a month later in January, you've got really 3 regiments that are kind of raising. Again, he wants them to be raised in the Highlands of Scotland. So let's go to this next article. Saturday, November 27th. It is said that Lord Loudoun has desired a reinforcement of 5,000 men at least, whom he recommends to be accoutred in the manner of the Highland Regiment. So I've got 2 articles here now stating he wants their men to be dressed in the manner of the Highland Regiment. One thing that I've learned about going through these records is some things are written in black and white. You know, it's straight to the point. You know what it means. There's no interpretation. Other stuff like this, you kind of have to interpret it. And that's why I'm adamant of trying to find the original letter that Lord Loudoun sent back to the War Office. I haven't found it in War Office records. However, Lord Loudoun's, a lot of his paperwork is at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. They now have an online database. You can kind of search stuff. And, you know, if you find stuff that you want, you can order it. They'll make copies for you. They usually do it in PDF format. Most of the archives now do that in PDF format, and they'll send it on out to you. Because I want to see what Lord Loudoun was talking about. I want his words. I don't want some editor's words who kind of did up these articles. Because what you could interpret from this, what one might interpret is, well, Lord Loudoun wants the Highland regiments all dressed in the Highland garb. He wants them wearing a bonnet, you know, a jacket. He wants them wearing plaids, you know, some type of stockings, the brogue shoes, that type of a thing. You could also take it as because Loudoun also commanded a Highland regiment, the 64th, that wore the Highland garb, including the government tartan, known as the Black Watch tartan today. That's the green and blue type government tartan that you may be familiar with. He may have just said, well, we don't, or it, I'm sorry. He may have said it in the letter that he wants them dressed specifically. He wants them wearing the specific uniform that he wore. We don't know. So at this point right now, this information can be interpreted a couple different ways. I guess it really depends on what side of the fence you're on. And I say all this because one of the things that I learned when I first started researching the regiment and I first started getting correspondence from people was not everybody, there were people that were kind of concerned. Hey, have you found what plaid Colonel Fraser wore? That came up a couple different conversations with folks. So it seems to be there's people on each side of the fence. We know that the 42nd Regiment, and we know that Montgomery's 1st Highland Battalion, later the 77th Regiment, we know that they wore the green and blue government tartan. People are on the fence with which one Colonel Fraser wore because there's never been any correspondence about it. No one's ever found anything, and nothing's ever really been published. I found something with my contact in London at the War Office that I'm going to reveal on the next episode of this, and I think you might find it interesting if it's one of those things that you care about. It may kind of leave you on the fence a little bit, but it may sway your decision whether you think that the 78th Regiment, well, first of all, if you've heard about this argument, and then secondly, whether you think Colonel Fraser and his men wore the standard government green and blue tartan, or if you think his regiment may have worn something else. Some people, again, they're on the other side of the fence. They think maybe he wore a red Fraser type of set, if you will, to his patterns. There's no evidence of that, but that's been brought up over the years. So that's why I wanted to talk about these first two articles that were discovered again in November of 1756. Now, mind you, this is about a month before the raising of the regiment. Recruiting started in early days of January. One other thing I want to point out to you is not too many people know this. So unless you've read my website, if you're familiar with this next article I'm going to talk about, then you don't know this information, and this will be new to you. Most people do not know that Colonel Simon Fraser was not the first pick to command the 2nd Highland Battalion. The Duke of Argyll was at the head of all this. So basically the way it worked, I'll get into more detail in the next episode, but the way it worked was Argyll submitted his names of officers that he wanted. He would submit those to William Cumberland, who was the king's son, and that would go to the king, and they would buy off on it, and they sent back their approval, and the officers were selected. The commanding officer, the first choice, and it's listed right here in the Derby Mercury on the 24th. 2 battalions of 1,500 men each are going to be raised in the Highlands of Scotland to be commanded by Colonel John Campbell, that's Argyll, and are to be sent to America. Major Montgomery and Major Mackay are to be lieutenant colonels of the battalions. Major John Mackay out of the 5th Regiment of Foot, he got the first nod. He was the first choice to command this 2nd Highland Battalion. But due to his declining health, he had issues. He removed himself from consideration, and he ended up dying about a year later. I want to say October, November of 1757. So after he removed himself from consideration, that's when the nod then went on over to Colonel Simon Fraser. Fraser had very limited military experience, and there's some officers who were selected and approved for an officership in the battalion, but they declined it. They didn't want it. Now, whether they didn't want to work or serve under Simon Fraser because of his father's name, his father was beheaded for, I think it was treasonous acts, or if it was because the limited military experience that Colonel Fraser had. I mean, it was a combination of both. Who knows why? Never found any evidence stating either or. But there's a handful, 5 or 6 officers that went ahead and declined it. But anyways, Colonel Simon Fraser gets the nod in very early January of 1757. And the recruiting process begins. We'll cover that again in the next episode. I would like to say I thank you for stopping on by today. I hope you found some of this information useful to not only your history knowledge, but to your general research. Again, I would encourage you to stop on by the website, see if you can find something. I would also encourage you to, if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. We're a brand new channel here. Just starting on out, so I'm kind of pushing for the 100 subscriber mark, if you will. If you like it, subscribe. I don't know the frequency that I'll be putting out information. I've got a lot of other things going on, but I'll try to do it maybe on a regular monthly basis, maybe even a bi-weekly basis. I'll have to kind of see how things on go. Again, I hope you enjoyed the information. Thank you for stopping on by, and take care. We will see you in the next episode.